Panelists you see on the show for the past year, they're joining me to discuss some of the big headlines of 2023, and there were plenty of them, right? So joining me today, PIX Politico reporter Henry Rosoff, as always from Politico, Jeff Coltin, from the city, Katie Honan, and executive editor at the New York Law School Center for New York City Law, Ben Mack. So great to have all of you here, some of my favorite people at the same table. By the way, congratulations on your new award, City and State Top Tweeter of 2023.
She told you not to mention that 3 seconds before.
Top Tweeter, that's a big deal.
I came in 5th place.
Hey, there's always next year. Let's begin, everybody, with the top issue, and that was really the migrant crisis. It's defined so much for the Adams administration. So I want to begin first and foremost with where we are kind of right now, right? Continued calls for these federal dollars. The mayor now seemingly pushing for seemingly anybody to go to Washington, D.C., saying, hey, you know what, if you have an issue with it, go to D.C. So, Henry, let me begin with you first. Is that message, after he said right here on this show, no aid's coming, is that really worth anybody's time?
Not according to the mayor's own words. He says he sees no end in sight to this. He, repeatedly checks in with the White House. Give him credit for going to D.C. an awful lot and making this case an awful lot. But the fact of the matter is he's really not gotten anything by his own admission, by his administration's own admission. And this crisis isn't winding down. We saw in one recent week at the the middle of December, we saw 3,800 migrants coming in 1 week. We got 60-day notices going to families. We're looking at, children potentially sleeping on streets by mid-January. This is getting bad, Dan.
Yeah, it's certainly getting bad, and the mayor is trying his best to strike this balance, right? We are a welcoming city, we're a city of immigrants, but at the same time saying, well, we can't do this because none of my successes from the past year have been highlighted, Katie, because of the migrant crisis. So how has he been doing in terms of communication in striking the balance? Has he done a good job?
I think it's still unclear on what his words have actually done in terms of how much they've hurt, I think, and I think even his criticism of the federal government, I don't think it's actually helped when he's gone down unsuccessfully multiple times to get money. And he's really pushed back against any implication that he has the more right-wing rhetoric when it comes to migrants. But in a lot of his words, he has seemed to be at least leaning towards that. He's blamed the migrants for a lot of the city's issues, where if you actually look at the budget, it's not only because of the migrants. So there's a lot of confusion there.
I know we'll get to 2024, but his words have been an early talking point for Republicans in 2024.
Yeah, well, and when you talk about the budget, right, there's always the cuts. And everybody, including everybody at this table, myself included, trying to nail him down on specifics for 2024, Jeff, right? Not only cuts, but what could you do to maybe cut some corners, and raising taxes is a possibility, specifically on the rich. He doesn't really give specifics when it comes to it, only cuts.
Yeah, he's been very consistently saying everything is on the table.
Yes, a very large table.
Everything is on the table. Exactly. I mean, we're talking cuts, layoffs. We don't know if that's going to happen. And in fact, there's a typical budget dance that happens in New York City where the city says, oh my gosh, we have this massive deficit that we need to fix. We need to make cuts. And then, every year, except for COVID, but every other year, the money shows up. They always underestimate because it's better to underestimate than, not have enough money. And so everybody, the city council, us reporters, all the advocates, I don't think we're quite as worried about the city's budget as maybe the numbers would suggest. There's definitely still a problem. And it's not just migrants. It's also fiscal cliffs. It's also very generous new labor contracts. I mean, the city actually is having some pretty serious financial problems. But again, the way that Eric Adams is talking, you would think that all the fire departments are going to close, and it's not maybe quite that dramatic. But he has a point he's trying to make, and the point is that we need help.
Right, but is he pegging it, Ben, on the migrant crisis, right? All the things that Jeff just kind of laying out, he almost is seemingly blaming the migrant crisis because of it.
Yeah, absolutely. He talks about that a whole lot more than he talks about any of these other reasons, including the federal funding running out or the labor contracts where he didn't seemingly negotiate that well for some sort of givebacks from the union, so they weren't that costly to the city. So he talks about that a whole lot more. I think one thing that's really interesting on the migrant conversation and the way the mayor's handled it is, clearly, if you look at the results, the way he's handled it has not worked, right? He hasn't gotten more money. He's gotten a little bit of help on sort of the paperwork front and the extension of temporary protected status for Venezuelans, so that's helpful. He's probably not going to get a lot more money from D.C. What he could get if he was talking a little nicer to the Biden White House, I think, is more of those federal sort of personnel helping up in the city to help with some of the processing.
Well, now he's talking about going down there to stage a protest.
with religious leaders.
With religious leaders outside, which doesn't, I don't know how that's going to work for the Biden administration. Look, let me talk about him himself, right? Because he's facing this FBI investigation that was plaguing him throughout the year, as the latter part of the year as well, including the raid of his chief fundraiser, who he now says has a new role, Katie, which is kind of looking at paperwork, no exact title. He said it last week, and then he kind of avoids the indictment question, but that's always kind of looming out there.
Well, there are inquiries, according to him, which I guess, again, he's not been implicated formally in any of this, but when you look through especially the last 6 months of this year, his buildings commissioner, who was a longtime ally of his, was indicted on some corruption charges and alleged bribery. Then you have 6 people who were involved in a straw donor scheme to benefit his campaign, not affiliated with him, but clearly wanted to curry some influence. Then you have the story of what happened with Brianna Suggs. The mayor's own phones were seized a few weeks after that. It's sort of dogged him throughout the last 6 months, and he's said he compartmentalizes and he can stay focused and no distractions and hustle and grind, but it's difficult. And I think it's affected his poll numbers. As New Yorkers were polled, he had a 28% poll, and the latest Quinnipiac poll, that's the lowest of any mayor since I started asking since 1996. So there's a lot of these concerns, and I think people, at least those polls, just don't feel that the mayor is trustworthy, and that can really bother for the next, a year and a half as we get through the 2025 race.
And you bring up a good point. I remember writing in August, wow, Eric Adams is having a really bad summer because of that, because of the migrant crisis as well. It was continuing. There wasn't getting any support. And now I think the mayor looks back at the summertime. We all look back at the summertime as, wow, times were good then compared to now. With the migrant crisis, just the number of migrants and the funding, seeing no ending in sight. And then, yes, now a federal investigation. I mean, the other investigations, they somewhat touched upon his campaign. We'll see. But this one seems, again, we know nothing. But this one seems a lot more serious. The FBI seized his phone briefly.
Well, and then the mayor, the phrase he relies on is, I always tell my people to follow the law, follow the law. How many times have we heard that? Every single Tuesday. There appears to be a lot of not following the law, and I'm talking about the indictments you already mentioned, assuming everything here comes back on the up and up. I'm not trying to make a presumption about this, but what we already know about some of the legal woes, the controls around his campaign and finances may not be as tight as he likes to project.
Well, where does the communication come in, Ben, right? Because he was here a few weeks ago for his year-end interview where he said that in 2024 he'd like to work on communications, right? He has a deputy mayor of communications. It seems like he's put some effort into that. Has he done a good job in communicating things when it comes to the FBI, when it comes to poll numbers and so on?
I think there's a lot of room for improvement that the mayor apparently recognizes in citing that as his biggest area to work on other than dealing with the migrant crisis when he spoke with you, and I thought that was really telling. The other thing, though, is that's sort of also a cop-out answer. Mayor Bill de Blasio said the same exact thing year after year when he was mayor. Other than homelessness for him, that was the thing he repeatedly cited, because it's not a substantive issue where you can say, oh, my administration made a mistake on topic X. You say, oh, communication, because we could be telling people how great a job we're doing.
Right.
But there is something to that. I think one of the biggest areas that ties into that is a real problem for the mayor is the way he's handling the budget. He is now known across the city as the mayor who keeps cutting library funding. That is just not a smart thing to do. And no matter how you talk about it, migrant costs, so forth, it's not going to be helpful to him when people are feeling that in their daily lives.
In fairness, there were some positives, right? Crime went down, and the mayor tried to address some of the things like, look, I did do some things that I said I was going to do along the campaign, crime being one of them, crime in the subway being one of them, and it was overshadowed by so many other factors. So what's another positive?
Well, he makes that point. I mean, we have, he's trying to claim, not trying to claim, he's claiming that more people are getting housing vouchers known as city FEPs, but the council kind of dragged him along with that one. You also have a number of technology initiatives I know he's very proud of. So I'm not dismissing the fact that there are accomplishments out there, but he himself admits that everything is overshadowed by the migrant crisis.
But quickly back on communications, they have done a lot. He's not out there talking about it enough. And this is just an age-old issue where if you want people to pay more attention to your accomplishments, you got to go out there and sell them and talk about them more. And he's right. Communication's been a big problem on that. The dyslexia screenings in schools and so forth. He should be out there talking about that at the schools.
Citywide composting is another example. Yeah.
We could talk about the Adams administration for the full half hour, but I want to talk about George Santos, because that was a big deal. That was a major player. First time in over 100 years that a congressman was expelled from Congress. So how is the Santos saga, in your view, guys, going to impact what happens in 2024?
Me or Jeff? Oh, no, I mean, well, the special election that's going to play out in February is going to set the tone for all of 2024. Money's probably going to start pouring in. We'll see what issues, probably a combination of abortion and immigration and the war in Israel and what balance of that. I mean, all the consultants are going to be watching. I mean, I can't underscore enough how important this election is, especially now that we know that we're going to have redistricting in New York. This district itself is very likely to change, because if the Democrats get control of this process, they're going to want to make it more of an advantage for, they hope, Tom Suozzi to reclaim the seat. So much watched.
But do you think, Jeff, that it's going to change the way candidates themselves are looked at and screened before applying into the whole process?
I know. I myself, I'm sure all of us, have been vetting the candidates a little harder this year.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that I've been sent information that maybe before I would have been like, I'm too busy, I don't have time to even look at that. I'm definitely looking at it now, because we all want to make sure that the candidates are presenting themselves as who they are. And that's going to be true for Congress, certainly, but I think also, I mean, across the board, city council, state senate, whatever. And yeah, this Santos, I mean, it's not going to be the last we hear of George Santos, of course. Well, he really loves a camera. But then also, and a cameo. And then Democrats, just the Democratic Party in general, is trying to tie every single Republican in New York, in the country, to George Santos, saying this is the party of Santos.
Which is not going to work, I don't think. And I think Republicans actually did something fairly smart by expelling him from Congress here, even though I don't know that they were going to be, the Democrats are going to be that successful attaching other candidates to Santos or Santos to other candidates, but especially now that he's out of office.
All right, we're going to squeeze in a quick break here. A lot more, everybody, coming up. We're going to talk more about the 2024 elections later on. But first, former President Trump has a long list of legal charges and fights ahead of him in the upcoming year. How they will impact his run for the White House when we come back. You're watching PIX on Politics.